Good morning. How is everybody today? Bright and shiny? How's my nice pagan section doing over here? Lovely. Lovely. Okay, we're back into our study in John. Jesus says in verse 12, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This should sound incredibly familiar. I don't know if you remember this, but when I started the series back in October, actually, I said there will not be a passage in the Gospel of John that we do not return, where we do not return to it. We return to those first 18 verses in every single passage, in every single chapter, and here we are again. This is what it said in the fourth verse of the first chapter. In him, Jesus was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Just as a reminder, John is quite a poet, and he's put this gospel together in an artistic way. In addition to the 7 signs, the 7 miracles, he calls them signs, there's the 7 I ams. There's actually more than that, and in 2 weeks we'll hit one that's not even included in the 7, that's actually greater than all the 7. But this morning we're in the second one, I am the light of the world. The first was I am the bread of life. So this morning I want to try to tackle this kind of difficult passage, and we're really going to be mostly looking at just a couple verses. I want to grasp kind of this dramatic scene that takes place because it really tells us what's going on. Excuse me. And then we'll look at this crazy claim that Jesus makes. And then we will look at what a dramatic call it places in on our life. So the dramatic scene. This is a really cool thing. So I hope I can do justice to this, and I hope you can follow it. In verse 12, our very first verse, it says, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, again, Jesus spoke to them saying. It doesn't look like much, but it's a huge deal for us in this massive continuing discussion. Again, Jesus spoke. Sometimes again just means like another time. We just finished today dog sitting for my son. I love my son's dog and my daughter-in-law's dog. He's an 11-month-old GSP. He's super smart. He went to Iowa for 3 or 4 months to be trained. He's like phenomenal. And he's an 11-month-old GSP. My house is full of mud and hair, and I think it's great that those of you with less intelligence have dogs. I think it's fantastic. Those of us who have come to a place of understanding know we don't want them anymore. We had our dog, we had multiple dogs. We timed our last dog to pass away right when our kids left the home. I missed it by 6 months. That's okay. And now my life is fantastic. And yours is full of dog hair and dog poop in your backyard. That was my own little diatribe. I apologize for that. Sometimes the word again means like I took him for a walk this morning, and then again, I just took him for a walk this afternoon. But sometimes again means that we're linking one thing with another, right? Right? So listen to verse 20 now. These words Jesus spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. See, the verse says he was in the treasury, but they didn't kill him. So what does John, the gospel writer, know that you and I don't know? Because John is shocked they don't kill him. John is saying if you really knew what was going on, what Jesus said and where he said it, you would be stunned he was not dead already. So the question is, what was so dangerous about what Jesus said and when and where he said it? Let's go back to our again. Again from what? Believe it or not, we are in, if I'm counting right, the 4th massive extension of the same exact scene we have been looking at for weeks now. I had no idea all of these passages and scenes actually went together in the same time frame until just recently studying this. This is what we just read a few weeks ago, back in John chapter 7, verse 2. Now the Jews' Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, as some of you know the word, was at hand. Remember what happened then. They were up in Galilee. Jesus' brothers say to Jesus, hey, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot is about to happen. It's one of the 3 times in the entire calendar year where every Jewish male is required to come into the city. The city swells with people. You've got to come, Jesus. His physical brother said, you've got to come with us. You'll be so popular. Jesus goes, nope, my hour's not here. That's not why I'm here. I'm not going with you. A couple days go by. Do you remember this? And then God speaks to him and says, actually, I want you to go now. Okay, so he goes, but go in quiet. So Jesus goes in quiet, and he's there for a day or two, and all of a sudden, the Spirit of God taps on him and says, the quiet thing's over, by the way. I want you to go up into the tabernacle, stand on the stage, and I want you to start teaching. Do you remember that scene? The tabernacles, or the booths, if you'll remember, are these kind of literally makeshift houses, if you will. They make them out of anything they can find, and you typically set them up. The Jews still do this to this day, by the way. You can see these in New York City, by the way. This is an ancient tradition. And their purpose was, as always, to remind the people when they lived in these temporary booths or shelters when they were wandering around to get to the promised land out of Egypt. It was a great festival for 8 days. And it was at harvest time. And it was commemorating God's provision in the wilderness. They had no homes. And because they had no homes, of course they had no harvest. So every year to commemorate this, they would live in these temporary shelters for 8 days to remember that God had their backs when they had absolutely nothing. And if this isn't ringing a bell, Jeremy and I are going to break down crying. So please just shake your head that you're recalling at least an ounce of this. And then dial it forward 2 weeks ago when Jeremy taught. For 7 days, if you'll remember, the high priest, had a golden pitcher. He would walk down to the pool of Siloam. He would dip it into the pitcher full of water. And in a long procession, everybody following him, they would go back up to the tabernacle and he would pour it over the altar. But on the 7th day, they would walk around the altar 7 times. He would walk around the altar 7 times before pouring it out to remind them when God had them march around Jericho when they first entered the promised land and the walls of Jericho toppled and he began to give them the promised land, to let them know their journey was finally over. God gave them this water in the wilderness when Moses struck the rock and they had no water. So at the festival, the priest would pour out the water, reminding them when they were so thirsty, and yet God gave them water from nothing that they so desperately needed. And then right on that day, do you remember that? The last day, the 8th day, the final day of the festival, when they were going to recite the famous verse out of Isaiah 12:3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation, Jesus interrupts the festival. He shouts out, do you remember what he shouts out? I know you remember because it's behind me. Go ahead, Tom, say it out loud. If anyone's thirsty, come to me, he says, as the priest is pouring the water over the altar. Well, remember, if you remember that, insanely, we're right back there again. Verse 12. Again, at the same festival, on the same last day or shortly thereafter. And then remember Jerry gave a brilliant message last week about the possible stoning of the woman caught in adultery, right? That took place after the festival was finished. But here we are again, back on that last day, the greatest day of the festival, as John described in chapter 7. Or again, shortly thereafter, there was something else that typically happened at this great festival. On the first day of the festival, when the festival began, they erected 3 75-foot menorahs in the tabernacle, in the temple, in the court of women, where the treasury was located. This is the very same treasury, if you remember this, where the widow gave the 2 coins, the 2 mites that Jesus highlighted in that same treasury in the Court of Women. The Court of Women was a place where everybody, all worshipers were welcome, men and women. They could gather and experience the joy of the Feast of Tabernacles around the great menorahs that were lit. I tried to bring my rangefinder in here this morning, and it was so dark it wouldn't bounce off the ceiling. But what would your guess be on the height of the ceiling in here? How high? 25. Yeah, 75 feet. These, not these, the menorahs. We read in the Talmud, rabbinical writings, which provide an accurate account of first century Jerusalem, kind of Jewish life, that the lights from these 3 75-foot menorahs were so bright, it not only lit the tabernacle and the whole court of women, it cast light down into all the courtyards in Jerusalem down below. They called it the illumination of the temple. In order to light these candles, I love this, they would send young men, read dumb, young men up ladders erected 75 feet on a daily basis to light these, and the wicks were made out of old priestly garments. And on the last day, the 8th day, after Jesus had interrupted the water ritual with his exclamation about all who are thirsty, come to me, they would extinguish the 75-foot candelabras. So, that's a lot of history. What is the point of the massive lamps? And what does it have to do with this morning's passage with Jesus? This festival scene isn't just about how they didn't have homes and thus they didn't have a harvest, and yet God provided. The festival was not just about how they were thirsty and God gave them water. It was not just about the fact that God conquered Jericho after they walked around the walls 7 times and gave them final rest in the promised land, where they are to this day, by the way. It was also how God gave them light in the wilderness. When they left Egypt, there was a pillar of cloud that sheltered them from the sun. And when the sun went down, the pillar of cloud began to glow at night. When it was totally dark, it became a pillar of fire. And when the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire moved, they would follow it. And when the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire stopped, they would stop and set up camp for as long as the cloud or fire remained. When they built the temporary mobile tabernacle under Moses, which was literally a mobile out of seal skins, and they would erect it in the wilderness, the pillar of cloud and fire would rest over the temporary tabernacle. And then finally in 1 Kings chapter 8, when Solomon built the fixed temple, the first one in Jerusalem, the cloud descended upon the tabernacle, as 1 Kings 8 says. And it rested on the tabernacle, and it was so powerful the people could not stand up. They fell to the ground prostrate. Why? Why? Because the pillar of cloud and fire was the presence of God himself. Going back to Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of cloud by night, here it is, did not depart from before the people. See, God came and he gave them light, his very presence. So now, back to the festival. Every night, they lit these 75-foot candelabras. But here's the really tragic thing about this festival. They had to light the massive candles because God's presence was not there anymore. See, there was a day where they had not candelabras because God was there. So on the last night, when they were taking everything down, right? Jesus has already interrupted the whole thing with his little water spiel. The whole festival is done. They begin to break down all the tables and the booths, and the young men begin to climb and break down these 75-foot candelabras. It was terribly sad. It was a terrible reminder of this. And that court, every year when they would take them down, you realize no one had seen God's glory for hundreds of years. See, the candles were a facade. They were quite a sad moment. Let me give you a couple more pictures from the Old Testament. There's this amazing scene in the book of Samuel. David shows up, King David shows up in later on in the middle of 1 Samuel, just to give you a reference. Saul, the first king of Israel, is earlier in Samuel. But way in the beginning of Samuel, there's a priest by the name of Eli. And Eli has two sons, and they're horrible, horrible people. And they're at war. Israel is at war with the Philistines. And long story short, the Philistines beat the tar out of the Israelites, and they take the Ark of the Covenant, you know, the golden box, right? With the 10 Commandments in them, with the cherubim wings on both sides, covering the lid of the box. The Philistines steal the Ark, which represented the presence of God. And Eli hears news of this. And Eli falls over dead and hits his head off of a log. And his sons were killed in the battle. His daughter-in-law was pregnant at the time. Why do I tell you all this? This is what it says in 1 Samuel 4:21. When the boy was born, she named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. Because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. You see, God's glory and God's presence, his light had been removed from Israel. Feel that in contrast with what the great prophet Ezekiel said much later in chapter 10. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud, there it is, filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. Sadly, though, after this, God removed his presence from Israel. For over 400 years, there's not a written document or a single sign that God ever spoke in the temple or his presence was ever in the temple. And that's in Jewish writings, by the way. John 8:12. I am the light of the world, Jesus says. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. You'll never guess when this was, when he said this. The last night of the festival, they dim the 75-foot menorahs. And on that night, here comes Jesus. Can you imagine? Pitch dark. The festival's done. You now have the reminder that God is not there. And this crazy rabbi wanders into the court of women and says, I'm the light of the world. I'm the light of life so that you shall have no darkness. Verse 20, these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him. No wonder John was so shocked. Jesus is right there at the treasury, right in front of the candelabras. As they go down, in a sense, he speaks up. It is dark. It's a brutal reminder that God's presence was not there. And he begins to cry out, not quietly, you are missing the glory of God. But guess what? I'm here. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Echoing the words of Isaiah hundreds of years earlier, no longer will you have the sun for light by day, nor for brightness will the moon give you light, but you will have the Lord for an everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Isaiah's words had finally come true. What a scene. So, then what is it Jesus actually saying? I am the light. I am the glory light. I am the actual presence of God that you miss. That was faked all of these years. I'm the cloud. Hear that? I'm the pillar of fire. I am God come to you. I am the Shekinah of God. And what he says is quite different. He doesn't say I'm light. He says I'm the light of life. Well, what does that mean? That's a different phrase. That means he isn't just there, meaning present, but his presence is life itself. He is the source of all of life, he is saying. And specifically, as I looked at this, I think this is at least three things. How is he the source of life? First of all, he's the source of all of existence. You know, the sun, S-U-N, the sun is the most basic source of our entire life. Nothing is more important to us on earth than the sun. Without the sun's heat and light, the earth would be a lifeless ball of ice-coated rock, much like the other planets. The sun warms our seas. It stirs our atmosphere. It generates our weather patterns. It gives energy to the growing plants that give us food and oxygen for life on earth. Without the sun, there would be no winds, no ocean currents or clouds to transport water. But unmediated, the sun will take everything away. You see, without protection, it burns and scorches and ends life. The atmosphere around us actually protects us. Otherwise, it would kill you. The sun gives us light, but if you stare at it too long, you go blind. We need the light for life, but if we get it, it kills. Jesus is the actual sun. We breathe only because he wills it. He is both magnificent and he's incredibly daunting. We studied this just probably 2 years ago in Colossians chapter 1. For by him all things were created. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things. And in him all things, there it is, hold together. You see, we see chaos all day long. Can you imagine for a moment what life would look like if Jesus, the light of life, the sun, dropped his right arm? Or his thought of us, atoms being held together, spun by the power of his voice. Life spins because Jesus wills it so. You have around 7 billion atoms in your body. 98% that get replaced on an annual basis, by the way. That's a 7 followed by 27 zeros. Each one held together and spun together by something. Hebrews chapter 1 says this: Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he, here it is, upholds the universe by the word of his power. Psalm 119, you have established the earth and it stands fast. By your appointment, they stand this day, for all things are your servants. This is Jesus, the light of life. He is the source of existence, but he's not just the source of existence. He's the source of all reality and truth. How does this work? I'm reminded of this every time I stay in a hotel or an Airbnb, which my friends say is a lot. And I realize that. When you're at home, and I'm at the age now where, yes, I have to get up in the middle of the night. And yes, it's more than once. And sometimes it's 3 and 4 times, and I'm comfortable with this now. I can do this by Braille, right? Pitch dark, no light, no moon. I know how many steps. I'm more than half asleep. I'm 90% asleep. And I do the whole thing fine. Never run into the closet, never trip over things, never, run into stuff until I go to a hotel or an Airbnb. Then it is scary. So if you're like me, I make sure, like sometimes if it's a hotel room, I'll put the light on and crack the door, which I don't like because then you go in there to go to the bathroom and it wakes you up. But you got to do it because it's better than stubbing and breaking your toe in the middle of the night. There's desks that are out of place. There's things in your path. You don't know the area. Light is what allows you to have the clarity to know where you are and how to navigate it. Jesus, the light, is the only way we can grasp reality, he is saying. About ourselves and about how life works, about what is real, about what is not real, what drives fear and anxiety and stress, and what grants peace. But the light in regards to truth is frightening and dangerous. We need light for knowledge, but if we get it, it cuts us to our soul. This is why we're so nervous to go see a counselor. I know almost nobody that goes, oh, I get to go to the counselor. Why? Because you have to face your soul at the deepest and darkest place. It is daunting. It's like for me, again, back in these hotels, thank God we do not have one of these in our house. But sometimes in these hotel rooms, they put those makeup mirrors. These are awful. And they're awful because I look in them. And you have to get way in there, and all of a sudden you go, holy crud, is that what my face and skin look like? I'm gonna die tonight. This is what truth does. It can be deeply disturbing. But when it is in the hands of the light of life, it brings freedom and healing and clarity and a clear path forward. When I was 30, I imploded inside myself. So afraid of people, so in need of approval. I remember Brian and I parked in a park one day, and I said to Brian at this picnic table, crappy little picnic table in Crow Canyon, I will never change. I will never I'd been a believer, follower of Jesus for 11 years. I will never get through this. And look who I'm saying this to. A guy who's suffered more than anybody I know. And he said, Jesus will walk you through this. You're in a tunnel and it feels like there's no end, or it's capped on the other side. It's not. Keep walking with Jesus and he'll walk you through the other side. Finally, I would say Jesus is the source of wellness. He says he's the source of all personal well-being. We know that feeling when we say we are full of life, passion, and energy and excitement and purpose and joy and peacefulness. But when that light is gone, it brings us down. Many of you are familiar with this thing called seasonal affective disorder. People in Seattle get it. People in Alaska really get it. They say people near the border, near the equator, get this maybe 1% or less. In Alaska, in the middle of the winter, over 10% of the people have seasonal affect disorder. They get deeply depressed. And one of their methods for solving it is literally giving them light, as a source of light. This is Jesus on steroids. He is the light of life. All personal well-being flows from him, he says. So he's the source of all existence, eternal existence, not just temporary inspiration, by the way. He's the ultimate source of reality and truth. And he says he's the ultimate source of personal well-being. Really, beauty. This is what we search for every day. Where is beauty and where can I find it? He is it. All other religions say, I point the way to these things, but not Jesus. The either lunatic or Lord says, I am the light of life. And now he is ever present within us, his glory residing in the sons of daughters of humanity for those who would receive him. We don't have to manufacture it. We don't have to produce it. We don't have to, try to mimic it. He is it. He is not the moon. He does not reflect someone else's glory. He is the sun. Well, this brings a radical and provocative call in our life then. For every one of us, no matter where we are. And it seems like I skipped most of the passage, but the rest of the passage really can be summed up, I think, rather easily. Jesus looks like he's on trial in the Gospels. He looks like he's on trial in this passage, but it is actually the other way around. Humanity is actually on trial. Jesus, you can't be your own witness. Jesus, you need a second witness. Jesus, you don't look like much. Jesus, you don't come from the right pedigree. Jesus, you don't come from the right town. These are all the arguments we've heard in these passages the last month. All things he has dealt with. And yet they still do not accept the truth. They don't want it. But humanity's on trial, not the light of life. This is going to be a radical statement, but we don't get to evaluate the cross. The cross evaluates us. Jesus requires that he be addressed to be dealt with. And I'm not saying that out of shame. I'm not saying that out of guilt. I'm saying that because if he is God, and if he created this, then he gets to say that. In John 8:12, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus demands a response. And I find myself so burdened for humanity, probably in three ways. First of all, for those that say they are followers of Jesus, he calls us to follow him. That's a radical call. That means live consistently. That means live attractively. That means don't look like everybody else in the way you approach life. That means the world harbors, we forgive. That means the world hoards. And the only thing the world worries about is, how do I get this retirement account up? And it's never up enough, by the way. And Jesus says, take your hands off it and start changing people's lives with your money. It requires us to be courageous. It requires us to pursue him every day. It requires us to say, I don't want to be the same today as I was yesterday. I want to lay down my golden calves, if you will, because if you want to change my thinking in some way, I want to do it. It means, Jesus says, be different like me. Lay your life down for others. Lay your rights down for others. Lay your freedom down for others. Our call is a very serious call. Not to gain the approval of God, we have that. We have the light, but rather because we are his priests to a world that is killing itself. Would by grace we don't look normal. Amen? Also, I would say this call is radical to the church at large. And there's this idea of universalism that's creeping into the church. Listen to these verses. They're not fun to read, by the way. I'd just soon they not be there. He said to them, you are from below. Now, he's saying this to the religious leaders, by the way. These are the people that had memorized the Old Testament. These are impressive moral people. You are from below. I am from above. He's standing in the temple treasury, by the way. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. There is a move within Christianity today. We want so badly for everybody to have kumbaya and everybody to end peacefully and everybody to be eternally great and with God. But unfortunately, now there's a movement in thought that just magically happens regardless of how you respond to Jesus. I would love it if that were so. I would love it if my faith allowed that to be so. Trust me, I can think of no more great thing. And yet Jesus doesn't allow me to think that. That is a bastardization of what Jesus says. You cannot say you take him seriously if you simply disregard his daunting call. This is where I think C.S. Lewis was so bright when he said there's only two options. He's either a lunatic on the level of a demon-possessed man that he's so crazy he's essentially a poached egg, or he's the Lord of the universe. There's nothing in between. You can't look at Jesus and say, well, he's a great moral teacher. No, he's not a great moral teacher. He demands more than that. If he's a moral teacher, why did he say, eat my flesh and drink my blood? That's not a great moral teacher. That is either an absolute lunatic or that's the Son of God. He is not the moon. He is the source of existence. He is not just a teacher of love. He is the light of truth. He is not just a temporary shift in your mood. He is the source of all well-being. Well, finally, to the world, he says, I want an answer. He came, he died, he wooed, he clarified, and he wants a response. Not out of anger. It's the last thing. See, when Jesus came, there's this verse in Isaiah. Jesus, when he was on earth, was harmless. I know that sounds strange because he emptied himself. Do you remember that? He did not grasp an equality with God, a thing to be grasped. He did not exploit his divinity. He set it to the side. And then Isaiah has this weird comment. A bruised reed he would not harm. You know that verse in Isaiah? What it means is when he came, he was harmless. He was the lamb, not the lion. He was the lamb saying, slaughter me. I'm here for you. I'm here to communicate to you your worth to me. But the Father looks at that and says, that is nobility at its finest. So to reject that, if you reject that, then you want nothing of heaven. If you reject that, then you won't want anything to do with me, because everything in heaven and everything about me is exactly what you saw in Jesus. You don't want him, you're not going to want me. He's the light of life, he says. Find him and you find life itself. Let's pray. Jesus, these are big words. Holy smokes. These are hard words for us. Would you cause us to take you more seriously as a result of today? To think of you more, to consider you more, to trust you more, to realize that you are the light of life, that you're the source of our existence, you're the source of our clarity and wisdom and reality. You're the source of our entire well-being. All of these things that we see physically in our world that look like they're going to give us life do not. And I know that because I've tried so many of them. May we turn to you in a greater way this week. And all God's people said,